This is episode 36 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Glyn Parry, Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Roehampton in London. I'm an Elizabethan historian. I've discovered new documents about John Shakespeare. Another great method for exploring the life of William Shakespeare, including listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
They had things like marchpane, which was an almond, rose water and sugar mixture that was carved and pressed into moulds and sometimes decorated with herbs and gilt gold if you could afford it, but perhaps not the Shakespeares. You also had something called almond or leech pudding, which is a little bit like a blancmange. Gingerbread, again, but not gingerbread as we know it. Gingerbread would have been bread and also dried ginger compressed together and mixed together.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
With the holidays upon us this Christmas Eve, we wanted to celebrate with our favorite Elizabethan, William Shakespeare. Christmas was a popular celebration even 400 years ago, and from the time young William was born growing up in Stratford Upon Avon, England, there were several important traditions that he used to mark the holiday with his family and friends. Here to help us explore the Christmas traditions surrounding the kinds of foods and festivities the bard would have eaten or participated in for his Christmas time is the townhouse steward at Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Emily Ireson. Every Christmas, Emily is in charge of dressing Shakespeare's childhood home to reflect a traditional Elizabethan Christmas, including Twelfth Night and seasonal festivities. With a master's in museum studies from the University of Glasgow, specifically studying fashion and culture of the 17th through 19th centuries, Emily joins us today to share with us the details of Christmas in the 17th century and what it takes to celebrate a Shakespearean Christmas. Emily, welcome. We're delighted to have you visit with us today.
No problem at all. My pleasure to be here.
So tell us about Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust. We've mentioned that this is actually the place where William Shakespeare was born, but tell us about the location and the purpose of this place.
Okay, so Shakespeare Birthplace Trust is the trust that looks after Shakespeare's birthplace. Now, Shakespeare's birthplace lies in Stratford Upon Avon in Warwickshire in England, and we get many, many visitors, over 800,000 visitors a year from all over the world. Now, this is the home where Shakespeare was born, and we actually have, we hope, the room that he was born in displayed as the birth room itself. Now, the building itself has many connotations over the years. It has been everything from a tavern or an inn and a butcher's shop. But obviously, firstly, it was Shakespeare's home. So when it was up for sale in the early 19th century, it was saved for the nation. And that's when the Birthplace Trust was created to look after the actual birthplace itself. And then subsequently on from then, we've got other buildings that we take care of in the area of Stratford Upon Avon, such as his daughter's house, Hallscroft, and also his final home of New Place and the location where that was. And that's what the Trust looks after day to day.
As the head steward, that means that you are responsible for the historical accuracy of things like Christmas decorations when they decorate Shakespeare's birthplace for holidays. I wonder,
yes.
Can you share with us what the process is for getting ready for Christmas?
Well, lots of research for a start. As a social historian, accuracy is very important to me. So we start off by doing a lot of research, not only sort of modern day research, but looking at traditional archives and writings of the time. There's lots of poems and lots of writings from people of the time explaining the festivities and what happens at Christmas. I mean, there's a bit of deciphering. You have to sort of understand, Old English, as it were. But you can pick out certain things like the greenery they used, the times and the most specific days and the festivities that they carried out every day over the festive period. So first of all, obviously the research. Then what I do is I talk to our gardens team. because foliage and the greenery for decoration is very, very important. We actually source all of the foliage used within the decoration from the other sites. So decorations, greenery such as holly and ivy, bay, box and laurel, we get from all of the sites. It's brought over to the main Birthplace site, and then we create the decorations from that, things like a kissing bough and very simple decorations and strewn foliage throughout the properties. Also, if they could afford it, the Tudors would have used things like bright red ribbon. So we also decorate with red ribbon in an authentic way. So that's just a little snippet. And then bringing together the feast, the Christmas feast, we put together a table decoration to represent something that the Shakespeares may have known for their Christmas feast.
So you mentioned the foods, and I wanted to ask about what kinds of foods would be served at an Elizabethan Christmas. We've read about peacock pie being served by Queen Elizabeth, but that particular dish was kind of outside Shakespeare's social status, wasn't it?
Yes, a little bit. So Shakespeare, we call Shakespeare family at the time, when Shakespeare was rather a young boy and throughout Shakespeare's life, of the middling sort or the merchant classes. So not the lowest of the low and certainly not the gentry, but someone who could afford a little luxury at the time of Christmas, for example. So the kind of foods they would have had on the Christmas feast table included pies and roasted meats, things like capon, which is actually a castrated chicken. Very, very popular meat at the time. Wild game birds as well, very popular, and beef and venison, for example. Also things like brawn and souse. And souse is actually pickled pig's feet and ears. So not that tempting to us, but very popular at the time. And also puddings as well. And not puddings as in the sweet puddings, but what they would have done, they would have had a mixture of spices and meats and probably oats, and they would have stuffed it inside intestines or stomachs of animals and boiled it up. And that was a pudding. So quite similar to what we have nowadays in England called black pudding, or you would think it call it blood pudding. So that was the idea of Christmas pudding in those days, very different to what we know. Now, what is actually very common, especially at the time of Elizabeth I and when Shakespeare was a young man, is that goose became incredibly popular. Now, Queen Elizabeth said that she wanted everyone who could afford it to have goose at Christmas as an homage to those who fought in the Spanish Armada. So that's where goose really became popular. Would you believe it? But Brussels sprouts, I know you may not have them in the States, but Brussels sprouts are a quintessential English Christmas vegetable. And actually Brussels sprouts aren't as late as people think. They had Brussels sprouts in Tudor times, not necessarily specifically for Christmas, but they still ate them. And obviously the most pièce de résistance, what would the modern Christmas be without turkey? Sadly, turkey wasn't really eaten at Christmas time in the way that we would nowadays. They did have turkey. I mean, there's documentation of Elizabeth and Henry VIII eating turkey, but it just wasn't linked to Christmas as it is nowadays. That came much later, about a century or two later, that turkey really became sort of the go-to meat at Christmas. So obviously you've got lots of meat, you've got bread, you've got sort of some vegetables, some cooked vegetables as well, perhaps some apples and cheese and some nuts for good measure. Then you've got the sweet treats. And I'll mention about the sweet basically being things like sugar-based items that were very expensive but could be afforded, at certain times of the year, like the festive period. They had things like marchpane, which was an almond, rose water and sugar mixture that was carved and pressed into moulds and sometimes decorated with herbs and gilt gold if you could afford it, but perhaps not the Shakespeares. You also had something called almond or leech pudding, which is a little bit like a blancmange. Gingerbread, again, but not gingerbread as we know it. Gingerbread would have been bread and also dried ginger compressed together and mixed together. Sometimes they mixed it with red wine, and that was called leech lumber. So leech lumber is, and what they did is they got the bread and the ginger, they mixed it all up, and once again they pressed it into these wooden moulds and turned it out, and that was also another sweet treat. And then sort of last but not least, something called comfits. Now comfits, basically the closest thing I can think of nowadays would be the little appetizing sweets you get at the end of an Indian meal. They're sugar-coated spices. So what they used to do is they used to get things like fennel seeds and comfrey seeds, And it would take a laborious, very long time to slowly coat them in little tiny bits of sugar that would be built up and built up and built up until you sort of had a little nugget with a little seed or herb in the middle that they would have as a digestive to help their digestion. Obviously, by this point, they didn't quite realise that sugar wasn't great for their digestion. All the teeth, of course, but that was very popular at the time. And these comfits then sort of escalated and evolved. And I mean, we have licorice comfits nowadays, which are the same, a piece of licorice covered in sugar. But yeah, that's the kind of things they would have had if they had a bit of money and they wanted to sort of splash the cash and enjoy it. We're not talking roasted peacocks and swans. They may have had something called a Christmas pie as well, which is a goose stuffed with a capon, stuffed with a partridge, stuffed with a pigeon, and then in a pastry case. Now, the Tudors, they didn't often actually eat the pastry itself. Nowadays, we'd make a nice pie, we'd put some meat and we'd have the whole thing. But they used the pastry case, or the coffin, as they called it, as sort of a bowl. So you'd cook it in this pastry bowl and then you'd eat the contents from that, which is... I know, it's a bit different to what we'd have nowadays. Obviously, the food is imperative, and it was food, it was feasting, but also drinking. Now, drinking was very, very important in Elizabethan Christmas. You had all things like wine, you had ales, you had wassail as well, which is part of a different Christmas tradition, which I'll talk about later, sack, which is a form of fortified sherry. Hippocras. Now, Hippocras is what I describe as the mother of mulled wine. So it's a spiced red wine with sugar, and it was served cold, not served warm as have it nowadays, but very, very, so one of these things, show off drink. If you had the money, you put it out there and you gave it to your guests, you gave it to your family. If you had money in the Tudor times, you wanted to flaunt it, and then the festive period was a perfect time to do that as well.
Exactly. Do you fix all of these then at Shakespeare Birthplace Trust each Christmas, or do you pick from these some of the best showy ones and put that out?
I pick from the best. So this year we had a beautiful roasted goose, and we had another thing as well, which has got a boar's head, which I'll talk about later too, decorated with things like cinnamon sticks and oranges, bay and rosemary strewn across the table with our normal tableware, but also then the room decorated with all the green foliage too. Now, I will say that all of my beautiful pies and goose and everything, they are made of plastic, sadly. Oh. I would love, because being a social food historian, I would love to be able to create these dishes, and perhaps next year I might make one or two. But to have them out and to have them displayed for as long as we need to have them out, they wouldn't last, and I would need to make fresh ones every week. So it is. So what I do instead is that I do a little taste or a little sampling every Christmas, and we'll do it the same every Christmas. We sample some traditional Tudor wassail, which is a very festive drink at the time, and we talk about Christmas and we show them the kind of setup that Shakespeare might have been used to, but not quite the food to taste. Not yet, anyway. Perhaps there's something I can develop for next year.
Oh, next year would be a great time to try that. I'll be there with a group. We're taking a group over there to see you guys in 2019. So you totally have my support for doing it.
Well, in that case, then perhaps I shall.
So you mentioned that the peacock pie and things like that aren't what Shakespeare's social class would have eaten. And you mentioned a minute ago that you were focusing more on what these Shakespeare's, when William was a child, more as your time period. So when you're choosing the different decorations for the birthplace, are you sticking to a particular section of history? Or, I mean, obviously Shakespeare performed at events that the royalty had. So he himself might have celebrated Christmas with something that maybe wasn't occurring back in Stratford. So which one are you guys sticking to there?
We focus on Stratford, we focus on the birthplace, and we focus on the period of history from 1575 to around 1600. So the younger years of Shakespeare's life. The room, the hall of which we represent as the Christmas feast is 1575 to 1580, 1590, the time of Queen Elizabeth I, hence the goose and hence the importance of that, but also something that Shakespeare as a boy and as his family, they would have recognised, something of this middling merchant classes. Nothing too elaborate, but a little bit of wealth. We usually do a marchpane, which is the almond and the marzipan style, just sugar-based dessert or sweet sweet treat. We have the goose, we have the very elaborate but also quite minimal decoration of the foliage and perhaps some red ribbon, but something that the Shakespeare's, as in Shakespeare and his family, would have known rather than something too elaborate. I mean, I would love to have a great big stuffed swan and peacock covered in gold, but we want to represent the true Shakespeare home. And we want to represent what Shakespeare may have known as a child. But there's no guarantee, but we take the information that we know and we put it across in the same level they would have known themselves.
So certainly a great way to sort of experience what it would have been like in that time period.
Absolutely. That's what we focus on. And as house steward, I want to be able to put across the history of Shakespeare and this time within his house in a visual way. So some of our visitors who may not be native English speakers can still get a sense and get a feel for that Tudor Christmas without having to have the visual, the words written down. They can see it for themselves.
Okay, earlier you mentioned that that the greenery that you put out and you listed off the different kinds. Now, in folklore, the greenery had sort of a connection with wood spirits and various Christmas legends. Can you tell us about the truth behind these myths? Was that something kind of done for children, or was this an actual belief? And what was the role of decorating with ivy and greenery at Christmas time?
Well, I'm not sure about wood spirits. I mean, the Tudors were very, very superstitious, especially leading through past Elizabethan to the Jacobean period. They were very, very superstitious. Christmas didn't change too much at all. The main foliage items that you'd use to decorate would be holly and ivy, bay, box, laurel, and yew, as in yew trees. The red of the hollyberry was meant to act perhaps as a ward off for some evil or an anti-witchcraft, but I haven't heard of any specifics about the reason the foliage is used. It's just very commonly used because it's the foliage of the time, and of the season, should I say. So it was used to decorate all sorts of houses and also churches too. There's a link to holly being to do with the crown of the Christ, so that was used within churches because of that and that time of year. One thing you will not see in a Tudor house at this time is actually mistletoe. So we know mistletoe. We have it for Christmas and we use it for all sorts. But mistletoe, actually, if that was chopped down and if mistletoe was allowed to touch the ground back in the time of Shakespeare, that was really bad luck. Really, really bad luck. It actually comes from a Druid and sort of pagan style early sort of superstition there, but that sort of carried on into the Tudor period. And so, mistletoe was a no-no until much later when it became the Christmas staple and the kissing under the mistletoe. And that's many centuries later.
Oh, wow. Well, okay, so you mentioned the greenery, but you also mentioned red ribbon. What other kinds of decorations are important when you're historically accurate representing this time period? What other decorations are important?
There's one thing in particular, which I haven't mentioned yet, which was crucial, and that is the Yule log. Now, this is not, in England we have the Yule log, but it's usually a chocolate cake. In the Tudor times, the Yule log was imperative because as work and as sort of any chores were banned during the festivities, the Yule log was brought in on Christmas Eve, and it was a great big log, as big, probably a metre wide and about a couple of foot tall, okay? And it would go into the fireplace, and the reason why it was so big is it was there to burn for as long as possible to enable you to enjoy the festivities and not have to go out and get wood. Now, it actually comes from an old Viking custom, but then that sort of developed. And then by the time you get to the Tudor period, you've got your Yule log, which you bring in on Christmas Eve. You decorate with, once again, your red ribbon and your foliage and your ivy. And then that then is lit and it's burnt all the way through, all the way until Twelfth Night. It's also very good luck if you take the remnants of your Yule log to start the next year's Yule log. So they will always keep the last little bit of Yule log to then start the burning of the next year.
Tell us about Twelfth Night. I know there is a lot of connections between Shakespeare, Twelfth Night, and Christmas, but what was the reality of the popularity of that play and that holiday for Christmas for Shakespeare?
Well, Twelfth Night was very important for the Tudors. There was 3 main days of importance over the entire festive period. So that is sort of Christmas Day, New Year's Day, and Twelfth Night, which falls on the 6th of January. Now, they gave gifts at this time, not on Christmas Day, and throughout the entire festive period, everything was leading up to Twelfth Night. And Twelfth Night was the culmination of all the festivities, all the drinking, all the partying. They also always had a Twelfth Night cake, and which always had a little bean inside, and the person who received the bean from the cake was then the allocated person of the party. And the 12th Night, the play itself, I mean, apart from the name, there's no direct link to that time of year, apart from the fact it was created to be shown on Twelfth Night. Okay, it's a comedy. It's there's no Christmas specifics within it, and it was just because it was being originally performed on Twelfth Night that it became Twelfth Night. So the Twelfth Night itself, we get our actors to do some performances of the Twelfth Night play around the time, but the Twelfth Night itself was just one of those additional festivities. We've lost it really in our day. We don't really celebrate it anymore. There's some countries and some cultures that do, but in England we've lost that importance of Twelfth Night that it would have been at the time of Shakespeare.
What about games? They may have, I know we've read some party games included reenacting scenes from Shakespeare's play Twelfth Night because of its lack of Christmassy theme in the play itself, but
yeah,
it's coincidental, I guess, time there. It gets brought into some festivities later. But when Shakespeare was a boy, obviously that play wasn't in place. So what kind of games or events would a young Shakespeare have played at Christmas time?
Well, the main thing, a little bit before Shakespeare, but Henry VIII actually banned games and sports at Christmas time. You couldn't gamble. You couldn't go out hunting. Only the very, very rich and very, very elite could do that. So when I said they brought that Yule log in, it's because you couldn't do anything. You were there to eat, party, have a good time, enjoy the festivities, and then everything started up again on Plough Monday, which was the first Monday after Twelfth Night. I mean, there may have been little party-type games, but nothing specifically. You wouldn't go out and gamble or have fun. What we would have. They would have mummers' plays, which are local plays to go around and reenact some plays. Sometimes they're folklore and things like that. And you would have also done some wassailing. Now, wassailing is something that happened at the time that it was bringing in good health and good cheer for the new year. You would sing, you may have poetry, recite poetry. It was a big party. Wassail itself was often served in a large communal bowl, okay, and passed around the party. Now, what was at the bottom of this bowl was a crust of bread. As all the alcohol was drunk and the crust of bread remained at the bottom, that crust of bread was given to the most important person, or who was deemed the most important person in the room. And they called that crust of bread the toast. And that's where we get our saying, to toast somebody. Is that a celebration?
There you go.
Okay, so along with the sort of festivities of wassailing, they also went around and they wassailed from door to door. They might sort of give gifts or receive ale in return, a little bit like Christmas caroling, but also more specifically to wishing good health and good cheer. And not only that did they go door to door, they used to go into their orchards and where their crops were growing, and they would wassail the good health and good cheer for the crops for the new year as well. And so you'll find wassailing around orchards quite popular at this time of year, specifically in areas where a lot of apple trees and a lot of apples were very important for the local community, whether it's food or cider or whatever.
So we've mentioned ivy and ribbon and the goose and wassailing, and I want to know what, in your opinion, is the one most important decoration, event, or aspect of celebrating a Shakespearean Christmas?
Well, this is a tough one, and I had to mull it over, but I'll be honest with you, it is the boar's head, okay? Now, the boar's head was the centerpiece and the main aspect of a Shakespearean era feast, okay? If you were the highest of the high, you'd have a boar's head. If you were the middling sort, like the Shakespeares, you'd have a boar's head. You may even have a boar's head or alternative if you're on the lower end of the scale. It was the pièce de résistance, if you like. It was brought out in great fashion, and it was placed out at the head or the center of the table. They wrote carols about it. One of the earliest Christmas Christmas carols is called the Boar's Head Carol. And it recites about the fact, I think the lines are, a boar's head in hand bare eye, bedecked with bay and rosemary. And that bay and rosemary was placed around the boar's head and it became that centerpiece. And because of the link between the Christmas carol and the Tudor carols and the iconic nature of the boar's head, that's why I think the boar's head is the sort of the main focal point for me of a Shakespearean or Tudor Christmas.
Excellent. And that one translates to so much of the time period. That makes sense that it would be so pivotal. So what about events or traditions that you can't bring into the 21st century? Are there any aspects of a Shakespearean Christmas celebration which would have happened in Stratford in the late 1500s that you can't, for whatever reason, do today?
I mean, I think that if you went around singing around orchards in Stratford nowadays, you maybe should funny farm.
You think be frowned upon, maybe?
Not frowned upon. I think people just might see it as a little different. I mean, I know there are people who still do it. If you go to the West Country in England, where there's a lot of apple production, some people who are of a different faith and prefer perhaps the pagan and the earlier faith, they still wassail. They still go wassailing around orchards. So I think that might be a little different in Stratford. But there's actually one thing, not so much of a tradition, but something that I think may also be frowned upon. And I have examples of people going, are you kidding me? In England, we have a very common food stuff that we have at Christmas called a mince pie. I don't know if you've heard of them before.
I've heard of them. We don't have them here in the
US.
US.
Well, basically, it's a sweet meat. It's got things like raisins and apples and currants, and it's a sweet pastry. It's like a little pie. It's very nice, and very, very common at Christmas. Now, mince pies are actually really, really early. People don't realise how early mince pies are. Now, mince pies have a very interesting history. Nowadays, we just stick them on the table and you have them with, your pudding. But actually, the mince pies themselves had 13 ingredients to represent Jesus and the apostles. All right?
Oh.
Every ingredient was in there. And not only that, there was one ingredient in Tudor mince pies that we would frown upon quite considerably nowadays, and that's actually mutton or sheep meat. Okay. Now, so what they used to do, they used to sort of similar ingredients that we have nowadays, the apples and sultanas and the nice things, and they used to mix that with mutton. And the mutton was there originally to represent the shepherds. Okay.
Oh, I see.
And not only that, but they would actually shape the mince pies, the Tudor mince pies, in the shape of actually a manger, sort of a rectangle shape. Oh. Now, this was very, very common at the time, but it was completely and utterly abolished in the 17th century when Oliver Cromwell came to power. Christmas kind of lost its Christmasness, okay? And he thought that having a manger-shaped mince pie representing, the Christ and the Apostles, that was blasphemy. How could you eat such a thing? And so they were completely and utterly banned. And it took another couple of centuries for them to be what we now know today. And then the mince pies today are round and covered in sugar and lovely. But the history of them, I think, is absolutely fascinating. How they grew up to what they were. They were completely abolished, but yet they still managed to crawl back in their own special way and become what we have every single year. I mean, Christmas in England wouldn't be Christmas without a mince pie.
Without the mince pie. Wonderful. Well, I have some questions not directly related to Shakespeare, but before I jump into those, are there any other aspects of celebrating an Elizabethan Christmas that you would want to share?
I don't know. I mean, personally, I think that as much as there may be differences in an Elizabethan Christmas to what we have nowadays, an Elizabethan Christmas is the mother of our Christmas. That's the beginning of our Christmas. And pretty much every aspect of an Elizabethan Christmas evolved into what we have nowadays. So a mixture of an Elizabethan Christmas and a Victorian Christmas, which is more like what we have. But without the Elizabethans, the Victorians wouldn't have that basis, which they then developed things like Christmas crackers and things like that. And the foodstuffs, the goose and everything, it slowly develops and makes Christmas what we have today, whether it's the mince pies or whether it's the roasted goose or the festivities and the time of year. It's a development from very, very early medieval period. It's part of the evolutionary process into Christmas as we know it today.
Well, so many things to thank Shakespeare for. Who knew we could also thank him for our Christmas celebrations. Well, well, I wanted to ask you to think about the books you've read over the last couple of years. What would you say are 2 or 3 titles that immediately come to mind as having had the biggest impact on you?
I'll be honest with you, there's a book that I have just finished reading, and funnily enough, I even think about work in my free time. It's a book called How to Be a Tudor by Ruth Goodman. And Ruth Goodman's a historian and does a lot of experimental archaeology here in England. And it's a book basically describing the day-to-day aspect of being a Tudor. Not the highest of the high, but a common labourer or yeoman farmer and what their day consists of. Going into all aspects of things like washing and domesticity and food and sleeping patterns and work and everything. And it's fascinating to look at the nitty-gritty of a Tudor rather than the lavish banquets and the great halls and all. It's looking at what it would like to actually be a Tudor. And she goes into great detail about the tiniest things from how to wash your hair to what you'd eat for breakfast. It's a fascinating book.
It sounds fascinating and it's an interesting read. Definitely going to pick that one up.
Yeah.
I believe that the study of Shakespeare's personal history is essential to the study of Shakespeare's plays. And I wanted to ask you about your tips or suggestions for studying Shakespeare's life in modern times.
Personally, I would always go back to original text. So I go back to a lot of original documents, books, manuscripts written at the time. Now, it may not be specific to Shakespeare, but it may be a sort of an eye view from their point of view. So, for example, when the Christmas is concerned, there's writings about people who actually went to Christmas events, and you get the kind of information, as long as you can sort of translate the text, because it is a little confusing sometimes, you can get the whole truth there, where over the years, if things have been written down several times, you could lose its poignancy, or it could, Chinese whispers, it can change the information. And I'm not saying that modern books aren't great. They are wonderful, looking at libraries and looking at all the information, but you can't beat going back to the primary resources, such as these original texts. I mean, at the Shakespeare Centre here in Stratford Upon Avon, we have a fantastic archive of books specifically to do with Shakespeare's time, life and works, including the Stratford, including Shakespeare. And I mean, I personally use them all the time for my research at work, but it's also open for the public to use as well. So if you are interested and you can get to Stratford Upon Avon, I would certainly say visit our archives, and the guys there are really, really helpful to help you find whatever you're looking for.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, my follow-up question was going to be how to get access to some of those original documents. I didn't know that there was that archive there in Stratford. That's wonderful.
We do. We have a very, very wide and wonderful archive, including the collections that we own as well within the property. But there's also other archives around the UK and probably overseas as well that have these original documents. But if you're focused on Shakespeare, you can't beat the actual Shakespeare archives in Stratford Upon Avon.
What a wonderful reason to visit. Well, so what's next for you? What are you and your team working on now that you're excited about?
Right. Well, I mean, as townhouses steward and head of conservation across the townhouses, we're just going through our final deep clean, or beginning our deep clean phase at the moment, which is basically we're focusing on preventative conservation across the houses, looking after both the houses and the collections which are inside. However, for me personally, I'm quite looking forward to a project we've got coming up. We're going to be reinterpreting a part of Shakespeare's Birthplace that hasn't been focused on wholly yet, and that is actually the latter half of the actual building, which is what was the Swan and Maidenhead Inn, or earlier the Maidenhead Tavern. It was actually came after Shakespeare had left, and also after Shakespeare's father had passed the house to Shakespeare. It became this tavern, this hostelry, this inn. And we have some rooms at the back which have formed an early 17th century extension. And what we're going to be focusing on, and we're going to be reinterpreting these rooms to tell the latter history of the property. So post-Shakespeare, about the interesting history of the property throughout the 17th, 18th, and then into the 19th century when it was saved by the Trust. And then obviously that is taken on from there.
Wow. Well, that is certain to be very interesting. We'll be watching and paying attention to that. Emily Ireson, Townhouse Steward at Shakespeare's Birthplace Trust. Thank you so much for being with us today.
You're more than welcome. Take care.
You'll find a gift from me over at the show notes for today's episode at cassidycash.com/EP36. Thank you so much for spending part of your Christmas Eve here with us at That Shakespeare Life this week. From all of us here at the podcast, we wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. In September 2019, I'm taking a group over with British History Tours to walk through the life of William Shakespeare. We'll be spending a couple of days in Stratford Upon Avon, and then we'll travel over to London to see the Globe, where we'll have a private behind-the-scenes tour there, and we're hoping to get to see a play. And I want you to go with us. It would be amazing to get to meet you at all, but certainly to get to meet you in William Shakespeare's hometown would be amazing. Please consider traveling with us and get your early bird tickets while they last. There's still a few of them left, but we are only giving early bird tickets to the first 8 people who sign up. But you can still grab some of those and get all the details about the trip at cassidycash.com/travel Shakespeare. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. Until next time, I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope your week is a Shakespeare-filled week.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.